"Get this pauper away from the table," my daughter-in-law said, her voice smooth and effortless, as if she were asking someone to clear an empty plate and not remove a 72-year-old woman from her own family dinner. The words hung in the air for a second longer than they should have, stretching across the polished oak table, slipping into the silence that followed. No one laughed. No one corrected her. The only sound was the faint clink of silverware as someone shifted uncomfortably, pretending not to hear. I looked down at my hands, folded neatly in my lap, the same hands that had set this table for over 30 years, the same hands that had cooked every holiday meal, every birthday dinner, every quiet Sunday evening, when this family still felt like something whole. I noticed a small stain on my sleeve, something from earlier that day, and brushed it lightly, as if that was the most important thing happening in that moment. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw the security guard hesitate near the doorway, unsure if this was some kind of joke. Ashley didn't repeat herself. She didn't need to. She simply lifted her chin slightly, her manicured fingers resting against the rim of her wine glass, and that was enough. The guard started walking toward me. I could feel Daniel's presence to my right, my son, sitting exactly where his father used to sit, but he didn't turn. He didn't say my name. He didn't even look at me. That silence told me more than any words ever could. I had seen that silence before, in smaller ways, over the past few weeks, but tonight it felt final. I slowly pushed my chair back, careful not to scrape it too loudly against the hardwood floor. The room was beautifully set, warm lighting reflecting off crystal glasses, a centerpiece of white lilies arranged just the way I used to like them. For a brief second, I wondered if Ashley had chosen them on purpose, or if it was just coincidence that she had recreated something that once belonged to me. I stood up without rushing, smoothing the front of my dress, a simple navy one I had worn to countless family gatherings before I became something unwelcome. The guard stopped a few feet away, his expression polite but uncertain. "Ma'am," he said quietly, as if he hoped I might save him from having to finish that sentence. I offered him a small smile, one that didn't reach my eyes but didn't need to. "It's all right," I said. My voice sounded steady, even to me. I picked up my purse from the back of the chair, the leather worn soft from years of use, and turned toward the door. No one stopped me. Not a single voice called out. Not even Daniel. As I walked past the long table, I let my gaze drift across each face. My granddaughter staring down at her plate, my nephew pretending to check his phone, Ashley watching me with a calm, satisfied expression that barely concealed the sharpness underneath. I had spent years believing that love in a family was something permanent, something that couldn't simply be removed like a chair from a table. Tonight, I understood how wrong I had been. The front hallway felt cooler, quieter, the hum of conversation fading behind me as I reached for the door. My hand paused on the handle for just a moment, not out of hesitation, but because I realized something very simple, something I should have understood much sooner. I had let them believe I didn't matter. I had let them think I was dependent, fragile, easy to dismiss. And that, more than anything Ashley had just said, was the real mistake. Not hers. Mine. I opened the door and stepped outside into the evening air, the faint scent of cut grass and distant traffic replacing the heavy perfume of that dining room. Behind me, the door closed softly, as if nothing significant had just happened inside. But I knew better. I walked down the front steps slowly, feeling the weight of the moment settle into something calm, something clear. I wasn't angry. I wasn't even surprised anymore. I was simply done being invisible at a table I had once built with my own two hands. I did not look back as I walked down the driveway, but I could still feel the weight of that room pressing against my back, like a door that had finally closed on something I had been trying to keep alive long after it had already faded. The evening air was cooler than I expected, and for a moment I simply stood there, beside the curb, holding my purse with both hands, listening to the faint hum of cars passing somewhere beyond the quiet neighborhood. It struck me how still everything felt, how ordinary the world continued to be, even as something inside my life had shifted completely. I took a slow breath and started walking, not toward any particular destination, just away. My shoes made a soft, steady sound against the pavement, a rhythm that grounded me in a way the dinner table never could again. It had only been 3 weeks since Harold passed, and yet the house that once felt like a place we had built together had already begun to feel unfamiliar, like a photograph that no longer matched reality. After the funeral, there had been a brief moment when I thought grief might bring us closer, that Daniel might remember who we were to each other before everything became so quiet and distant. But instead, something else had taken root. Conversations became shorter. Eye contact became rare. Decisions started happening without me, small at first, almost easy to overlook. A drawer reorganized. A cabinet emptied. A set of keys that no longer sat where they always had. At the time, I told myself it was just adjustment, just the natural shifting that follows loss. But standing there now, under the dim glow of a street lamp, I understood those moments for what they really were. They were not adjustments. They were removals. I reached the corner of the street and paused, glancing back just enough to see the warm light still glowing through the front windows of the house. From the outside, it looked exactly the same. Inviting. Whole. Like nothing inside had changed. I wondered briefly if anyone had resumed their conversation, if the sound of laughter had returned once I was no longer there to disrupt it. The thought did not hurt the way I expected it to. It felt distant, almost like something that belonged to another person. I continued walking, my pace unhurried, my mind moving through memories not with sadness, but with a kind of clarity I had not allowed myself before. I remembered the first time Ashley corrected me in my own kitchen, her tone light but firm, as if she were helping, rather than replacing. I remembered the way Daniel had laughed it off, brushing it aside as harmless, even though I had felt something tighten in my chest at the time. I remembered the holidays that followed, the subtle shifts in seating arrangements, the way I was gradually moved from the center of conversations to the edges, then from the edges to silence. None of it had happened all at once. That was what made it so easy to ignore. That was what made it so effective. By the time I reached the end of the block, I realized I was no longer walking aimlessly. My steps had become deliberate, directed towards something I had not yet fully named, but could feel forming beneath the surface of my thoughts. I was not lost. I was simply no longer standing still. A car passed by slowly, its headlights sweeping across the sidewalk for a brief second before disappearing into the distance. And in that moment of light, I caught my reflection in a darkened window. For a second, I hardly recognized the woman looking back at me, not because she looked weak or defeated, but because she looked composed in a way I had not felt in a long time. There was no panic in her expression, no confusion, just a quiet understanding that something important had ended and something else had just begun. I adjusted the strap of my purse on my shoulder and continued forward, already knowing that tomorrow would not look anything like yesterday. And for the first time in weeks, that thought did not frighten me. It steadied me. The next morning began quietly, the kind of quiet that does not comfort, but instead reveals everything you have been avoiding. I woke up before sunrise, not because I had anywhere to be, but because my mind had already started moving long before my eyes opened. The small guest room I had slept in felt temporary in a way I could not ignore. The unfamiliar ceiling, the faint hum of an old air conditioning unit, the absence of anything that belonged to me. I sat up slowly, placing my feet on the cool wooden floor, and for a moment I simply stayed there, letting the stillness settle around me. There was no rush, no voice calling from another room, no expectation waiting for me at the breakfast table. I walked to the window and pulled the curtain aside just enough to let in the early morning light. The street outside was nearly empty, a single car parked across the road, a newspaper lying untouched at the end of a driveway. It was the kind of ordinary scene I had passed by 1,000 times without noticing, but now it felt different, as if I were seeing everything with sharper edges. I made my way to the small kitchen, filling a kettle with water and placing it on the stove, listening to the quiet click as the burner came to life. These small, simple actions grounded me, gave me something steady to hold on to while everything else rearranged itself in my thoughts. As I waited, I found myself thinking about the conversation I had overheard 2 nights before the dinner, the one I had not allowed myself to fully process at the time. Ashley had been in the living room, her voice low but precise, speaking to someone on the phone. I had not meant to listen, but my name had caught my attention in a way that made it impossible to walk away. She had been discussing timelines, logistics, and options, words that sounded harmless until they were placed next to phrases like long-term care and transition period. At first, I convinced myself I was misunderstanding, that she was talking about someone else, some distant relative or acquaintance. But then she mentioned the house, the maintenance costs, the inconvenience of having extra space tied up when it could be used more efficiently. I remember standing there in the hallway, my hand resting lightly against the wall, realizing that I was not part of that conversation in any meaningful way. I was the subject, not the participant. The kettle began to whistle softly, pulling me back into the present. I poured the hot water into a cup and sat at the small table, wrapping my hands around the warmth as if it could anchor me. That was the moment everything began to connect, not in a dramatic rush, but in a quiet, deliberate sequence that left no room for doubt. The changes in the house, the distance in Daniel's voice, the way Ashley had slowly taken control of decisions that once belonged to me and my husband. It had not been sudden. It had been planned. I took a slow sip of tea, letting the realization settle without resistance. There was a time when I would have questioned myself, wondered if I was being unfair, if grief was distorting my perspective. But that time had passed. What remained now was clarity. I stood up and walked back to the bedroom, opening my purse and taking out a small envelope I had carried with me without fully acknowledging why. Inside were copies of documents Harold had insisted we keep organized, papers he had reviewed carefully in the months before he passed. At the time, I had trusted him completely, never feeling the need to understand every detail. Now, I realized he had been preparing for something I had not seen coming. I sat on the edge of the bed, spreading the papers out in front of me, reading each line slowly, not searching for comfort, but for truth. The language was formal, precise, but beneath it was something unmistakable, a structure that did not align with the version of reality Ashley had been building around me. I traced one line with my finger, reading it again, then a third time, making sure I understood exactly what it meant. A quiet breath escaped me, not out of relief, but recognition. Whatever they believed about my place in that house, about my dependence, about my silence, it was built on an assumption that was no longer true. I gathered the papers carefully, placing them back into the envelope, and closed my purse with a soft, deliberate motion. Outside, the sun had begun to rise fully, casting a pale gold light across the room, illuminating everything with a clarity that felt almost symbolic. I stood there for a moment longer, not hesitating, not questioning, simply acknowledging that the version of me they had dismissed the night before no longer existed in the way they believed. And for the first time since Harold was gone, I understood exactly what I needed to do next. I left the small apartment just after 8 in the morning, the envelope resting quietly inside my purse, its presence more steadying than I expected. The air had warmed slightly, carrying the faint scent of coffee from a nearby cafe, and the distant hum of a city already in motion. I walked with purpose now, not fast, not rushed, but certain, each step aligned with a decision that had already been made somewhere deeper than thought. The law office was only a 15-minute drive, but I chose to walk the first few blocks, letting the rhythm of movement settle the last of my hesitation. By the time I reached the main road and hailed a taxi, I was no longer questioning whether I should go. I was simply following through. The building itself was familiar in a way that felt both comforting and sobering, a quiet brick structure with large windows that reflected the morning light. Harold and I had come here together more than once, always leaving with the quiet reassurance that everything had been handled, everything accounted for. At the time, I had trusted that completely, never imagining I would one day return alone, carrying questions I had not known how to ask before. Inside, the reception area was unchanged, the same muted tones, the same neatly arranged chairs, the same sense of order that seemed to exist outside of time. The receptionist looked up as I entered, her expression shifting from polite professionalism to something softer as she recognized me. "Mrs. Collins," she said gently, standing up. "I am so sorry for your loss." I nodded, offering a small, controlled smile. "Thank you," I replied. My voice sounded calm, even to me. She gestured for me to sit, explaining that Mr. Harrison would be with me shortly. I took a seat by the window, placing my purse carefully beside me, my hands resting lightly in my lap as I watched the faint movement of people outside. It was strange how normal everything seemed, how the world continued to move in its usual patterns while something so fundamental in my own life had shifted. A few minutes later, the door to the inner office opened, and Mr. Harrison stepped out. He looked older than I remembered, Or perhaps it was simply that I was seeing him differently now, not as part of a shared routine with Harold, but as someone who held pieces of a reality I needed to understand for myself. "Margaret," he said, his tone warm but measured. "Please, come in." His office was exactly as I remembered, shelves lined with neatly organized files, a large desk positioned near the window, the faint scent of paper and polish in the air. He gestured for me to sit, and I did, placing my purse on the desk before me, but not opening it yet. For a moment, neither of us spoke. He seemed to be studying me carefully, as if weighing how much to say, how quickly. I met his gaze without hesitation. "There is something I need you to clarify," I said, my voice steady, free of accusation, free of doubt. He nodded slowly, folding his hands together. "I suspected you might come," he replied. Given the timing. That single sentence told me more than I expected. It confirmed that what I had begun to piece together was not coincidence, not misunderstanding, but part of something that had been set into motion long before I realized it. I reached into my purse and took out the envelope, placing it on the desk and sliding it toward him. "I reviewed these this morning," I said, "but I want to hear it from you." He opened the envelope carefully, scanning the documents with a practiced eye, though I could tell he already knew exactly what they contained. When he looked up again, his expression had shifted slightly, not to surprise, but to something closer to acknowledgement. "Your husband was very thorough," he said. "He wanted to make sure that there would be no ambiguity." I held his gaze, waiting. "The primary residence," he continued, choosing his words with precision, "was placed under a structure that cannot be altered without your direct consent. Not your son's, not anyone else's, yours." The words settled into the room quietly, without drama, without emphasis, but their meaning was unmistakable. I felt no rush of emotion, no sudden relief, only confirmation. "And any attempt to transfer or sell it?" I asked. He gave a slight shake of his head. "Invalid, unless authorized by you personally and witnessed under specific conditions." I sat back slightly, letting that information align with everything I had experienced over the past few weeks, the conversations I had overheard, the decisions that had been made without me, the assumptions that had been allowed to stand unchallenged. They had believed something that was not true, not because they had been told otherwise, but because I had never corrected them. I closed my purse slowly, my movements deliberate, controlled. "Thank you," I said. There was nothing more to ask. Not yet. As I stood to leave, Mr. Harrison watched me with a thoughtful expression, as if he understood that this conversation was not an ending, but a beginning. Outside, the sunlight felt brighter than it had that morning, the world sharper, more defined. I stepped onto the sidewalk with the quiet certainty that the version of events unfolding in that house was built on a foundation that no longer existed, and when the time came, I would not need to raise my voice to correct it. I would only need to let the truth speak for itself. By the time I returned to the house that afternoon, everything looked exactly as it had the day before, as if nothing had shifted, as if the dinner, the silence, and the quiet removal had never happened at all. The front door opened smoothly beneath my hand, the familiar scent of polished wood and faint floral cleaner greeting me like a memory that had not yet realized it was no longer welcome. I stepped inside without hesitation, closing the door softly behind me, and for a brief moment I simply stood there in the entryway, listening. There were voices in the kitchen, low and casual, the soft clink of dishes, the sound of something being prepared as if this were just another ordinary day. I set my purse down on the small console table where I had always left it, the motion so natural it felt almost automatic, and walked toward the kitchen at an unhurried pace. Ashley was standing by the counter, scrolling through her phone with one hand while stirring something with the other, her posture relaxed, entirely at ease in a space she had gradually claimed as her own. Daniel was seated at the table, his attention fixed on a tablet, his expression neutral, detached. Neither of them looked up immediately when I entered, and that small detail told me everything I needed to know about how firmly they believed their version of reality had already taken hold. It was Ashley who noticed me first, her eyes flicking up briefly before settling into a composed, almost pleasant expression. "Oh," she said lightly, as if I had just returned from a short errand rather than being removed from the table the night before. "You are back." There was no apology in her tone, no acknowledgement of what had happened, only a quiet assumption that nothing needed to be addressed. I nodded once, moving toward the cabinet and taking down a glass, filling it with water at the sink. Yes, I replied simply. My voice remained calm, steady, giving nothing away. Daniel glanced up then, his gaze meeting mine for a fraction of a second before shifting away again. "Mom," he said, the words sounding more like a habit than an intention. There was a pause, brief but noticeable, as if he were considering whether to say more, but he did not. He returned his attention to the screen in front of him, the moment passing as quickly as it had come. I took a sip of water, letting the quiet settle between us, observing rather than reacting. Ashley turned back to the stove, stirring slowly, then spoke again without looking at me. "We were actually going to talk to you today," she said, her tone carefully measured, as if she were introducing something reasonable, something inevitable. I did not respond immediately. Instead, I placed the glass down gently on the counter and waited. She continued, "Daniel and I have been discussing some changes that might be better for everyone. The house is a lot to manage, and we have been looking into options that would give you more support." The words were familiar now, almost rehearsed, echoing the conversation I had overheard days before. The same language, the same careful framing. I turned slightly, leaning back against the counter, meeting her gaze directly for the first time since I walked in. "Support," I repeated quietly. She nodded, her expression softening in a way that might have seemed genuine to someone who had not been paying attention. "Yes," she said, "a place where you would not have to worry about upkeep or responsibilities. Somewhere with people your own age, activities, structure." Daniel shifted slightly in his chair, but he did not interrupt, did not add to the conversation. He simply allowed it to unfold, as if his silence were agreement. I let a few seconds pass before speaking again. "And the house?" I asked. The question was simple, but it carried more weight than the words themselves. Ashley hesitated just long enough for it to be noticeable, then answered, "Well, it would make sense for us to take that on. It is already set up for a growing family, and we would be able to maintain it properly." There it was. Not hidden, not softened, just presented as logic, as if the conclusion were obvious. I nodded slowly, as if considering her words, as if this were the first time I had heard them. Inside, everything remained clear, steady, aligned with what I now knew to be true. I picked up my glass again, finishing the last sip of water before placing it back down with a quiet, deliberate motion. "That is very thoughtful," I said. My tone remained even, unreadable. Ashley smiled slightly, encouraged, mistaking composure for agreement. Daniel finally looked at me again, something uncertain flickering across his expression, but he still said nothing. I turned away from them then, walking calmly out of the kitchen and toward the hallway, my steps measured, unhurried. I did not argue. I did not correct them. Not yet. There would be a time for that, a moment when assumptions would meet reality in a way that could not be ignored or dismissed. But that moment was not here, not in a quiet kitchen conversation framed as concern. For now, I allowed them to continue believing exactly what they wanted to believe, because the certainty they carried would make what came next impossible to deny. And as I reached the doorway and disappeared down the hall, I understood something with complete clarity. They were not preparing me to leave. They were preparing themselves to take something they did not actually own. That evening, I moved through the house quietly, not hiding, not sneaking, but choosing my moments with care, the way someone does when they already understand the shape of what is coming and simply needs to let it unfold at the right pace. The hallway felt different now, not because anything had physically changed, but because I no longer saw it through the same lens of belonging. I paused briefly outside the study, the room Harold had used for years, a space that had slowly been emptied of his presence piece by piece after he was gone. The door was slightly open, and inside, I could see the desk, still positioned exactly where it had always been, though the items on it were no longer arranged the way he would have left them. I stepped inside, closing the door softly behind me, and walked toward the desk with a calm, deliberate pace. The surface had been cleared of most personal items, replaced instead with neatly stacked folders and a few decorative objects that felt more like placeholders than anything meaningful. I opened the top drawer and found what I expected, documents sorted but not deeply examined, the kind of organization that gives the impression of control without fully understanding what is being controlled. I did not rush. I moved through each section carefully, reading headings, scanning dates, allowing the pieces to align with what I had already confirmed earlier that day. There were notes in Ashley's handwriting, small annotations in the margins, references to meetings, to evaluations, to options that had been discussed without my knowledge. Words like transition and planning appeared more than once, always framed as if they were being done for my benefit, never acknowledging the assumption underneath them. I closed the drawer gently and stood there for a moment, letting the quiet settle around me. There was no anger rising in my chest, no sudden urge to confront or correct. What I felt instead was something steadier, something far more useful. Understanding. I turned toward the bookshelf along the wall, running my fingers lightly along the spines of the binders Harold had kept meticulously labeled. He had always believed in clarity, in leaving nothing open to interpretation, and now I could see just how intentional that had been. I selected one binder and brought it back to the desk, opening it slowly, reading through the sections with a level of attention I had never given them before. Each page confirmed the same truth from a different angle, reinforcing the structure he had put in place, the safeguards he had quietly ensured would remain intact no matter how circumstances changed. I replaced the binder exactly where I found it, leaving everything undisturbed, just as they had left it, just as they expected it to be. As I stepped back into the hallway, I could hear voices again from the living room. Ashley's tone light, conversational, speaking to someone on the phone, her words carrying just enough to be understood without being fully overheard. I did not need to listen closely. I already knew the direction of the conversation, the confidence in her voice, the assumption that everything was progressing according to plan. I walked past without pausing, continuing toward the staircase, my steps quiet but certain. In my room, I sat down on the edge of the bed and opened my purse once more, taking out the envelope and placing it beside me. I did not open it this time. I did not need to. What mattered was no longer just what was written on those pages, but how and when it would be revealed. I leaned back slightly, my gaze settling on the far wall, and allowed myself a single, steady breath. For weeks, I had been reacting without realizing it, adjusting to changes I did not fully understand, trying to maintain something that had already been redefined without my consent. That phase was over. Now, every action would be intentional. Every word would be chosen. I would not argue in the kitchen. I would not defend myself at the table. I would not correct assumptions in passing conversations. When the moment came, it would not require explanation. It would not require raised voices or emotional appeals. It would simply require the truth, presented clearly, in a way that could not be ignored or reshaped. I stood up and placed the envelope back into my purse, closing it with the same quiet precision I had used all day. Outside the window, the light was beginning to fade, the sky shifting into soft shades of gray and blue, the house settling into its evening rhythm. From downstairs, I could hear the faint sound of laughter, light and easy, as if nothing had been disturbed, as if the foundation beneath it all had not already begun to shift. I moved toward the door, pausing just long enough to listen, not with doubt, but with recognition. They were comfortable, certain, unaware, and that certainty would be the very thing that made what came next impossible for them to prepare for. I turned the handle and stepped back into the hallway, no longer as someone waiting to be included, but as someone who had already decided exactly how this would end. The next 2 days unfolded with a quiet precision that would have looked ordinary to anyone watching from the outside. But for me, every detail carried intention. I woke early each morning, moving through the house as I always had, making coffee, opening curtains, straightening small things that no one else seemed to notice anymore. Ashley greeted me with polite distance, her tone carefully balanced between courtesy and control, while Daniel continued his pattern of brief acknowledgments and long silences. Nothing in their behavior suggested doubt. If anything, they seemed more settled, more confident, as though the conversation in the kitchen had already set everything in motion. That confidence worked in my favor. It allowed me to observe without interference, to move through the spaces they believed I no longer understood. On the second afternoon, I found Ashley at the dining table with a stack of brochures spread neatly in front of her, glossy pages filled with images of landscaped courtyards, smiling seniors, and bright common areas. She looked up as I entered, offering a small, composed smile. I thought you might want to take a look at some of these, she said, sliding one brochure slightly forward. They are very well reviewed, and they offer a lot of amenities. I walked over slowly, not immediately sitting down, letting my gaze pass over the images without touching them. The places were presented beautifully, of course. Soft lighting, wide hallways, carefully staged comfort. I recognized the strategy behind it. Not pressure. Presentation. Make the option appear desirable, even generous. I placed my hand lightly on the back of the chair, but did not sit. They look very nice, I said calmly. Ashley nodded, encouraged. We just want to make sure you are somewhere that suits your needs, she added, her voice gentle, almost reassuring. Daniel glanced up from across the room, watching the exchange without speaking, as if he were waiting for a reaction he could not quite predict. I met Ashley's eyes for a moment longer, then gave a small, measured nod. I will think about it, I said. The words were simple, neutral, offering neither agreement nor resistance. That was enough. Ashley leaned back slightly, satisfied, as if a step had been completed. Later that evening, I moved through the house again, noticing how small changes continued to accumulate. A framed photograph of Harold and me had been moved from the living room shelf to a side table in the hallway. A set of documents that once sat in the study had been replaced with newer folders, labeled in Ashley's handwriting. These were not large gestures. They were adjustments, subtle and consistent, each one reinforcing a narrative in which I was gradually becoming unnecessary. I paused in front of the photograph, studying it for a moment. Harold's expression in the picture was calm, steady, the same quiet confidence he had carried through most of his life. I reached out and adjusted the frame slightly, aligning it so it faced forward again, not tucked away at an angle. It was a small act, but it felt deliberate. That night, as I sat in my room, I took out the envelope once more, not to read it, but to hold it, to remind myself of what remained unchanged beneath everything they were trying to reshape. I thought about the dinner, about the moment the guard had stepped forward, about the silence that had followed Ashley's words. That moment had not been the beginning. It had been the reveal. Everything leading up to it had been preparation, whether I had recognized it at the time or not. Now, I understood the structure clearly. An understanding gave me control. The following morning, I approached Ashley in the kitchen while she was organizing something on her tablet. "Those places you showed me," I said evenly. She looked up immediately, alert but composed. "Yes," she replied. I folded my hands lightly in front of me, keeping my posture relaxed. "I would like to visit one," I said. There was a brief flicker of surprise in her eyes, quickly replaced by approval. "Of course," she said. "That is a great idea. We can schedule something for later this week." Daniel, standing near the counter, turned slightly toward us, his expression shifting, as if he were reassessing something he had already assumed was settled. I did not look at him. I kept my focus on Ashley. "That would be fine," I said. My tone remained steady, cooperative, exactly what they expected, exactly what they needed to hear. Ashley smiled, already reaching for her phone, her movements efficient, confident. In that moment, I could see it clearly. They believed the plan was working. Greeted us at the entrance, her smile warm and professional. She introduced herself and began walking us through the building, her voice steady and reassuring as she described the services offered, the daily routines, the community events designed to keep residents engaged and comfortable. I listened without interrupting, taking in every detail, not just what she said, but how it was presented. Everything was structured to remove concern, to make transition feel like relief rather than loss. Ashley nodded along, asking questions that showed she had already considered each answer, while Daniel followed quietly, his attention shifting between the guide and the surroundings. We moved through common areas filled with soft lighting and carefully arranged furniture, past rooms where small groups sat together, some talking, some simply watching the world pass by through large windows. Nothing about it was unpleasant. Listening, observing, allowing the moment to unfold without interruption. When we stepped back outside, the sunlight felt sharper, the air cooler against my skin. This were simply the natural next step in a process already completed. I entered the room without announcement, taking my usual seat at the table, the same place I had occupied for decades, though now it carried a different weight. For a brief moment, Ashley's eyes flickered toward me, a small pause in her rhythm, before she resumed her task, her expression composed, untroubled. She believed everything was already settled. That belief had carried her this far. It would carry her into what came next. Dinner began quietly, conversation light, almost rehearsed, as if everyone understood their roles and preferred not to stray beyond them. Ashley spoke about the visit, about availability, about timelines that sounded efficient and reasonable. Daniel added occasional comments, his tone measured, careful, as if he were aligning himself with a decision he had already accepted. I listened without interruption, my hands resting calmly on the table, my posture unchanged. When Ashley finally turned her attention fully to me, her expression softened into something that resembled concern, though it remained carefully controlled. "We think it would be best to move forward soon," she said. "The place we visited has an opening next month, and it would give you time to adjust comfortably." I nodded once, acknowledging the statement without confirming it. "That sounds very organized," I replied. My voice remained steady, neutral. She smiled slightly, encouraged, and continued. "There are just a few documents we would need you to review and sign, mostly formalities to make the transition smooth." She reached beside her and placed a folder on the table, sliding it gently in my direction. The motion was subtle, practiced, as if she had imagined this moment many times. Daniel glanced at the folder, then at me, his expression unreadable, waiting. I looked down at the folder but did not open it immediately. Instead, I let my fingers rest lightly on its surface, feeling the weight of it, not as something threatening, but as something revealing. After a moment, I opened it slowly, scanning the pages with calm attention. The language was familiar now, structured, precise, designed to appear routine while quietly shifting control. I turned a page, then another, not rushing, allowing the silence at the table to stretch just long enough to be noticed. Ashley remained composed, her hands folded neatly in front of her, her posture steady. She was confident, certain. That certainty was the final piece. I closed the folder gently and placed it back on the table. Then, without raising my voice, without changing my expression, I reached into my purse and removed the envelope I had carried with me for days. I placed it on the table with the same deliberate care Ashley had used moments before, sliding it toward the center where it could not be ignored. The shift in the room was immediate, though subtle. Daniel's attention sharpened. Ashley's posture adjusted slightly, her composure still intact, but no longer effortless. I opened the envelope and removed the documents, laying them out one by one, aligning them neatly, each page visible, each detail clear. "Before I sign anything," I said calmly, "there is something you should both understand." My voice did not rise. It did not need to. The words carried their own weight. Ashley's gaze moved across the pages, her expression tightening almost imperceptibly as recognition began to replace assumption. Daniel leaned forward slightly, his focus narrowing, as if he were seeing something for the first time that had always been there. "The house," I continued, my tone steady, "cannot be transferred, sold, or reassigned without my direct authorization. Not yours, not anyone else's." I paused just long enough for the meaning to settle, not forcing it, simply allowing it to exist in the space between us. Ashley's hand moved slightly toward the folder she had presented, then stopped, her confidence shifting into calculation. Daniel's expression changed more visibly, uncertainty breaking through the calm he had maintained. I gathered the documents back into the envelope slowly, not rushing, not pressing, simply restoring them to their place. "I will review your papers," I added, "in my own time." I closed my purse and placed it beside me, my movements calm, final. No one spoke immediately. The room, so carefully arranged, so deliberately controlled, had shifted in a way that could not be undone with words or explanations. I did not need to argue. I did not need to defend. The truth had already done what it needed to do. I stood from the table, smoothing the front of my dress with the same quiet composure I had carried from the beginning. As I turned to leave, I paused for just a moment, not to look back, but to acknowledge the space itself, the table, the room, the life that had been built within it. Then I walked away, not as someone being removed, but as someone who had just reminded everyone exactly where they stood.